Hello, my name's Nerida Campbell and I'm the Acting Head of Curatorial at Sydney Living Museums. Welcome to today's Discover SLM talk, and I extend a particularly warm welcome to our members, donors and supporters. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on whose land I live and currently work. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future. Curators of SLM are constantly discovering new stories about the people, places and things we care for at our 12 sites. During this talk series, we'll be sharing some of this research with you as we explore a range of topics from food to furnishing textiles, from celebrity marriages to colonial bungalows. Join me every Tuesday at 4 till 4:30 to hear our curators delve into a new topic. Today's speaker is Mel Flyte, an assistant curator with Sydney Living Museums, working primarily within the House Museums portfolio. She has a background in art history and theory, specialising in late 19th century art and design movements. She is interested in collections care and preventative conservation and enjoys being hands-on with a wide range of objects in our collections. In 2019, she curated the family exhibition On the Move at the Museum of Sydney. If you have a question for Mel, add it to the Zoom chat and she will answer it at the end of this talk. She's also going to add some links into the chat for you to enjoy later. Thanks, Mel.
Thanks, Nerida. And I think this will form a really nice kind of bookend to your fabulous talk last week about the shady ladies of the 1920s. Today, I'll very much be talking about the other end of the spectrum, a much more kind of respectable showbiz lady in a very kind of glamorous period of entertainment in Sydney. And it was really difficult to kind of even select the images for this show today because there's just so many wonderful pictures from this period. So I really hope you all enjoy it. I'd like to begin also by acknowledging the Gadigal people as the traditional owners of the land upon which I'm meeting you today. Today, I'll be talking about the biggest celebrity wedding in Sydney's history, not Keith and Nicole, but Madge and Cyril. And surprisingly, this event is connected to Elizabeth Bay House, one of Sydney Living Museums' house museums, which hosted the couple's wedding reception in 1935. Let me briefly introduce the property for those unfamiliar with Elizabeth Bay House. On its completion in 1839, it was considered the finest house in the colony, built at great expense by Colonial Secretary Alexander Macleay. The house stood like a Greek gleaming temple set amidst 54 acres of private estate. Its lush botanic gardens, spread across the surrounding slopes and down towards the harbour, were internationally renowned. By the early 20th century, after the period of occupation by the Macleay family, the house sat practically empty on a traffic island, its garden lost, serving primarily as an artist's squat. In 1935, a century after the first stone was laid, the house was reopened as an events venue following an extensive yet sympathetic restoration. The first major party held here was the wedding reception of musical comedy stars Madge Elliott and Cyril Ritchard. Simply put, Madge was the darling of the Australian public, and she chose Elizabeth Bay House for her grandest performance. This event, the most talked about in Australia at the time, was a celebration not only of marriage, but also of celebrity. Who was Madge Elliott? She's probably not a familiar name to many today. She was born Leah Madeline Elliott in London in 1896. Her family immigrated to Australia when Madge was a baby, and she spent her youth in Toowoomba, Queensland. When she was in her early teens, the family moved again, settling in Sydney's east. Sydney's cultural atmosphere proved more suitable for the talented young Madge, and she began dance training at Minnie Hooper's Dance Academy, a place redolent of the theatre, as she later recalled. Madge launched her stage career at the age of 15 in a children's ballet with the Melbourne Grand Opera Company. After working hard on improving her singing voice, which she claimed was always a little weak, she was ready to move into the professional theatrical world. She was soon starring in the kinds of musical comedies popular in the post-war period. These tended to pair a male and female star who could sing, dance, and perform a level of physical comedy that kept the shows light and agreeable to audiences. Madge's first partner on stage, Paul Plunkett, was considered too short for her. So Miss Hooper suggested the taller Cyril Ritchard, one of the dance chorus members from the back row. Apparently, Madge's first comment to Cyril was, "I don't dance with beginners." She thought him too young, although he was in fact only 1.5 years her junior. Cyril Ritchard was born in Sydney in 1897. He studied medicine at the University of Sydney, but left this to pursue on the stage, much to his father's disappointment. He didn't have a lot of dance training, but was tall and good looking, so was selected as a possible partner for Madge. Despite Madge's initial lack of enthusiasm, they began their pairing in 1918's show Katinka. It seemed the pair hit it off professionally, spending all their time together perfecting new routines. Cyril was debonair and elegant, and most importantly, hardworking. He would become one of the most graceful and skillful dancers the Australian stage ever produced. By 1921, the pair had forged a strong partnership. The pairing would go on to become one of Australian theatre's most successful. They joined the J.C. Williamson Company, known as The Firm, and performed in Sydney, Melbourne, Perth, toured regionally and throughout New Zealand. As Madge's star rose, her fan base grew, and despite her British origins, she would be unequivocally claimed by her adoptive nation of Australia and cherished by her admirers, who called her our Madge. Though their popularity was growing in the early 1920s, the pair felt their chance to shine as solo stars was waning, with Cyril desiring to become a more serious actor, while Madge preferred the musical comedy world. Australia's parochial cultural scene struggled to compete with the lure of the theatrical epicentres abroad, and the pair briefly separated when Cyril headed to New York in 1922 to try his luck in theatre and film there. Madge had been working continuously on the stage since the age of 15, and by 1922 was burnt out, her health suffering. She planned to take some time off from work and travel to recover her strength. She headed to England via the USA, visiting Cyril in New York. Once in London, she enjoyed visiting West End shows and meeting the stars of the London stage. Before long, she apparently felt the call of the spotlight again and decided to return to work. Very quickly, she was cast in the starring role in Better Days. In 1925, the pair were reunited, with Cyril joining Madge and the pair taking the lead roles in Bubbly, followed by Lady Luck in London's West End. So began a 7-year period of international success with incredibly busy schedules and huge workloads. If shows were particularly popular, they could run for a year with over 320 performances. Stage shows such as this were the go-to entertainment in the evenings for well-to-do middle-class Londoners. Madge was the star of the duo, taking top billing and earning more than Cyril, £75 a week plus 5% of any takings over £1,500. But Cyril continued to pursue his acting career and began being cast in cinema roles, starring alongside big names of the day such as Igor Novello. In 1932, after enormous success in the UK, the pair discussed a return to Australia to re-establish their careers here. This decision was made with much trepidation. Madge apparently feared being forgotten. They returned to J.C. Williamson's company and starred in Blue Roses in Sydney and Melbourne. Madge's fear of not being welcomed back proved unfounded. On her arrival in Sydney, she was greeted by cheering crowds eager to see the West End star. She recounted, "My heart glowed with the warmth of that reception, leaving no doubt in my mind that I was home again." Madge by now was a seasoned professional and understood the importance of maintaining a positive public persona. She was extremely good at managing her marketing, offering the press interviews and repeatedly praising the Australian audiences for their support. Always modest, slightly self-deprecating, and authentically charming and cheerful. It's not hard to see why she was such a crowd favourite. The London stage called again, and in 1933, Madge and Cyril returned there via Hawaii and the US, where they visited several Hollywood film studios and met stars of the emerging silver screen, including Gary Cooper and Clark Gable. Settling back into their London life, they again found huge success on the stage. Then in 1935, there was a surprise announcement. After more than 15 years of professional partnership and much speculation about the nature of their relationship, Madge announced her engagement to Cyril by means of a large sapphire ring, blue being Madge's favourite colour. The announcement coincided with a new tour of Australia and New Zealand. For many years, Madge had been reluctant to reveal any personal details about her life, and Cyril was equally coy. While many simply assumed they were romantically linked due to their long professional partnership, for years Madge requested that people not say she was in a relationship with him. Everybody thinks that because we dance together, we must be, but ours isn't that sort of association at all. We are just good companions, Cyril and I, she had stated years before. By the 1930s, both were considered past a suitable marrying age. Madge 39, Cyril almost 38. Unfortunate rumours were also beginning to emerge about Cyril's private life at a time when homosexuality was still a crime and considered objectionable by many. Concern for their reputation, as well as societal and familial pressure, probably played a role in the engagement announcement. Marriage would legitimise their offstage relationship and align their private lives more closely with their stage personae, always presented as romantically linked, respectable, high society darlings. It seems likely that Cyril was homosexual and that it was not a secret amongst the theatre crowd. Lavender marriages, as they were known, were not uncommon at the time, and a sad truth for those in the public eye when revelations of homosexuality could potentially ruin a career. In Noel Coward's diary entries about Madge and Cyril, who often performed in his plays later in their careers, he made it quite clear in typically dry and hostile fashion that Cyril's attempts to repress his sexuality were transparent. He wrote in 1961, "Poor Cyril Richard was quite dreadful. He camped about like an old-fashioned queen at a drag party. All his innate vulgarity came bubbling unpleasantly to the surface. I do wish that years ago Cyril had faced up to the fact that he was queer as a coot, renounced the Catholic faith, and given way horribly to his sexual urges rather than bottle them up." They were, however, a devoted couple, and the marriage announcement was well received by audiences. Madge had drafted by 1935 a retelling of her story, which shifted the narrative of their relationship slightly. She again used her abilities with the press to reframe the story of their partnership to suggest love was always present. To coincide with their return to Sydney, she wrote a series of autobiographical pieces for Australian audiences and suggested that her feelings for Cyril had been romantic, not platonic, from the beginning. This certainly helped to dispel the rumours that the marriage was one of convenience to protect their public images. They had simply taken a while or been too busy to make a formal commitment to what was a long and deeply personal connection. The wedding date had been set for the 16th of September 1935, conveniently timed to fall between the theatrical tours of Australia and New Zealand. Despite protesting that they wanted a simple affair, the pair chose to hold the service at St Mary's Cathedral. Hundreds of guests were invited, and a 3-tier ticketing system was implemented to manage the overwhelming interest from the public to secure a peek at the bride. 40 guests, mostly relatives, were allowed inside the Archbishop's sacristy where the ceremony took place. A further 250 tickets were reserved for friends, and 2,000 general tickets were allotted for the remaining space in the cathedral. The decision to hold the ceremony in the sacristy was based on the slightly controversial fact that Madge was a Protestant and Cyril a Roman Catholic, and mixed marriages were not permitted at the main altar. In her usual unflappable style, Madge announced that she would not be converting to Catholicism, but would settle for holding the religious ceremony in private within the sacristy without the high mass, thus circumventing any issues. On the day of the wedding, thousands of fans flocked to the cathedral, hoping to be admitted. Guests and fans who managed to obtain a ticket were unable to contain their excitement inside the cathedral. Some jumped up on pews to get a view of Madge as she walked down the aisle, and a priest had to shout, "Kindly remember you are in a house of God." Those who missed out on a spot inside could at least listen to the service outside as it was broadcast through speakers. Some had arrived hours earlier to secure the best viewing spot. Barriers had to be erected and more than 50 police officers called in to help control the crowds, which had stopped traffic around Hyde Park. When the bride and groom emerged from the cathedral after the service, the waiting audience erupted in applause. Blustery winds whipped Madge's long veil into the air as she descended the stairs before being whisked away to the reception. It was described in the press of the day as the biggest and most spectacular theatrical wedding in our annals. The extravagant wedding dress was made for Madge by London-based couturier Peter Russell, a close personal friend. The press claimed that it would be the finest dress ever worn in Australia, quite the sartorial sensation. Madge's decision to choose a foreign fashion house to produce the dress caused much displeasure amongst Sydney-based designers like Germaine Rocher, who responded, "Of course we could make a frock like that. Any dress in any design can be made here." So intense was the public interest in the dress that when tabloid newspaper Smith's Weekly managed to procure a photograph of the dress from the London dressmaker, they had it rushed to Sydney by airmail to be the first to publish in the Australian press. Copies of the photograph were also displayed outside Smith Weekly's offices in Sydney, Brisbane, Melbourne, and Adelaide. For the dress, Madge had chosen ivory waxed ciré lace, reportedly sold at 5 guineas a yard, so roughly $680 a yard, and nearly 40 yards, so that's 37 metres, were apparently required, with a train of 6 yards, which is a 5.5 metre train. The lace was mounted over white peau de soie satin. The design and construction of the dress was so intricate that when it arrived for fitting from England, little pieces of paper had been sewn into it with instructions for how to fasten each section. Under the hem was stitched a true lover's knot of blue silk for added romance and the obligatory blue element. The dressmaker's assistant in Sydney was quoted as saying, "Somehow it seems to give just the last touch of romance to it all. And what a wonderful romance it is. Our Madge and Cyril getting married." The public was very much in favour of the union. The reported expense of the dress quickly escalated, with some sources claiming it cost nearly £450, so that's nearly $60,000 in today's money. Ever conscious of public perception, particularly by Australian audiences, Madge made the unusual step of responding to the criticism in the papers, stating that the dress was a wedding gift from Peter Russell and wouldn't cost her anything. She also reiterated that, of course, an Australian designer could have made an appropriate dress for her, but that Peter understood her requirements as he was a close friend. And I particularly like this quote. Not for one moment would I suggest that designers here could not produce wonderful frocks. Madge and Cyril were friends with Arthur Wigram Allen, who owned Elizabeth Bay House in 1935. The house had recently been let to Mrs. Hall and Mrs. Minette, who had undertaken the extensive restoration and decoration of the interiors in order to operate the house as a reception venue. The grandeur and opulence of the house after the redecoration work must have appealed to Madge, for she chose the untested venue to host the reception and spent her final days as Miss Elliot staying in the house. She most probably prepared for the wedding in an upstairs bedroom. At the reception, the 300 invited guests, including the who's who of the theatrical world, were entertained in style. Oriental rugs, tapestries, damask wallpaper, gilt mirrors, and cedar furniture gave the house a glamorous old world charm, most likely the type of venue Madge and Cyril were used to from parties during their time in the UK. The dining room was used for a huge buffet banquet and to display the wedding gifts, the drawing room and the saloon for the formal photographs. The library had been converted into a ballroom, and Madge descended the stairs for the first dance to the song Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, despite the incongruous lyrics, my lover's flown away and I am without my love. As she descended the stairs, Madge displayed her renowned wedding dress to great effect, posing for photographs and film at the foot of the spectacular elliptical staircase. Some of the magic of that event survives today in our photographic archives. The Australian Women's Weekly reported on the lavish event, stating, "In the century that has passed since its building, many lovely and gracious ladies have swept down the winding staircase, but none more lovable or better loved than the little bride in the wonderful lace gown with the true lover's knot nestling under its folds, our Madge." Outside Elizabeth Bay House, crowds had gathered to catch a glimpse of the couple, chanting, "We want Madge." They were duly rewarded when Madge came out onto the terrace to wave. It seems Madge had a fondness for calla lilies. It forms her wedding bouquet and pops up in gift bouquets she holds in various photos throughout her career. The calla lily was named after the Greek goddess Calliope, patron of music and a muse, so it seems very fitting for her to have that as her favourite flower. Madge's receptions set the tone for events at Elizabeth Bay House. Over the next 4 years, there was a stream of glamorous receptions, dances, and social events until the sale of the house in 1939 and its subdivision into bedsit apartments. After finishing their tour in New Zealand and honeymooning in Hawaii, the newlyweds returned to London to begin their married life. They took up residence in a luxurious flat near Savile Row that bore a door plate, Elliot Richard, Madge given top billing, as she always was in their professional life. Family life did not become a reality. Sadly, a son born in 1939 died a few hours after birth. Madge, now 43, would not bear another child. Work did not stop for the pair, however. They toured extensively throughout the war years, performing in the Merry Widow from 1944 until the end of World War II, entertaining troops and raising morale in Cairo, Alexandria, Paris, Holland, and Brussels. They returned to Australia in 1946 to tour, still referred to in the press as Our Madge and Cyril, still so familiar to Australian audiences despite prolonged periods of absence. Fittingly, their final stage performance together was in Sydney in a 1951 performance of Noel Coward's Private Lives at the Palace Theatre. By this stage in their careers, they had moved away from the physicality of the musical comedy world, and no doubt tastes had changed to move away from that light-hearted and slightly twee style of entertainment. By the 1950s, Cyril's career had finally begun to outshine his wife's, as he settled into life in the United States as a successful and serious film actor and producer. 1954 saw Cyril's most renowned performance when he starred on Broadway as Captain Hook in the musical version of Peter Pan. In 1955, after a 2-year battle with leukemia, Madge passed away in New York, aged 59. Cyril claimed they had never been apart since their glamorous Sydney wedding 20 years before. Cyril survived his wife by 22 years, dying in 1977 at the age of 79. He never remarried and only returned to Australia on one occasion, appearing on stage in 1960. Despite being largely forgotten figures today, for more than 30 years, Madge and Cyril were the most popular artists of the Australian theatre, darlings of the stage, and beloved entertainers who never forgot their roots. We go on, for there's much to say about this pair. I have a real fondness for Madge, the way she effortlessly managed her public persona, her face never showing the strain of celebrity, always presented with a smile, smartly dressed, a united front with Cyril, despite the sadness of losing a child and the secret she kept for Cyril for their whole lives together. In the public eye, she remained a beloved Aussie, a charming theatrical star who never got too big for her island home. I hope you've heard some interesting things today and enjoyed hearing about this pair. As Nerida mentioned, I've shared some links in the chat, so you can actually see some archival film footage of the pair, in particular their wedding, which we actually had in our collection at the Caroline Simpson Library, an old kind of video cassette that I've had digitized, so you can have a little bit of a look at their wedding reception in Elizabeth Bay House. And if you're really interested, the personal collection of Cyril's photographs have been digitized and are in the collection of the National Library of Australia, so you can check those out there. So thank you very much, and if you've got any questions, please do pop them into the chat.
Thanks, Mel. I've got a question. Where's the wedding dress now?
Oh, it's a really good question. I actually don't know. So that's the thing. You would think that such big stars would have some kind of public museum or archive or something, but I just haven't been able to track down where Cyril's, well, his photographs exist, but Madge's photographs, her kind of career doesn't seem to be reflected in any archive, and I certainly don't know where the wedding dress ended up. So maybe someone listening today is a distant relative and has the wedding dress in their cupboard at home, because we'd certainly love to see it or have it donated to an archive somewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. It looks amazing. Were there other celebrity weddings at Elizabeth Bay House?
Not as big. So this was really, it's quite bizarre because it was literally the kind of first event after the building opened as a reception venue, and it really set a high note. We know of multiple other events, including lunches with foreign representatives and, fashion designers and weddings and things like that, but nothing to the scale of Madge and Cyril's wedding reception. This really was the kind of peak of the weddings and events at Elizabeth Bay House. Although it still is a reception venue, so we never know. We could beat that if we have a big wedding there in the next couple of years.
When was the peak for Elizabeth Bay House to be run as a wedding venue?
It was a really brief period. So, it had sat empty for such a long time. So sort of from the late 1920s, they really didn't know what was going to happen with it. In the 30s, it was still empty. There were talks that it might be torn down because a lot of the big mansions at the time in King's Cross were being torn down, and blocks of apartments were being built because King's Cross and Potts Point were really the place that people wanted to live. And so very quickly in the 30s and 40s, it became the most densely populated place in Australia and remains that way today. And so it really was quite a lucky survival. In 1935, the two ladies, Mrs. Hall and Mrs. Minette, converted into this reception venue. But by the end of the 1930s, end of 1939, they moved to different premises. The building is purchased by a lady called Mrs. Oldham Murray, who subdivides it into bedsit apartments. And that essentially saved the building from being torn down. And it remained that way right through until the 1970s. But it was just that kind of 4-year period where it hosted these very, very lavish events, a very brief, sparkling period in its history.
Well, thanks, Mel. We're actually at 4:30 now. So thanks for joining us, everyone. We'll be back next week at 4 o'clock where Dr. Scott Hill will talk to us about colonial bungalows. Thank you. Have a great evening.